Do you remember a few years ago when women would film themselves asking the men in their lives how often they think about the Roman Empire? And the results were always surprising, from a couple times an hour to a couple times a month. Well, today's guest has thought about the Roman Empire for decades, every day, I'm sure. I'm speaking with Professor Warren Carter. He teaches at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma, previously at Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. Though originally from New Zealand, he did his PhD at Princeton. Professor Carter has recently published a 1,800-page commentary on the Gospel of Matthew and the Illumination series. He's also written a commentary on Mark, and he's an expert in the Roman Empire and really leads us to think about how did the early Jesus followers navigate the reality of the Roman Empire. So we talk a lot about that today. Were Jesus and Paul anti-empire? What might that mean for Christians today? How do people misread Pontius Pilate? And how does he respond to criticism that he is too obsessed with the Roman Empire when it comes to reading the New Testament? All of this and more in today's episode. Whether you agree or not with some of the theological implications of his opinions, which unfortunately we didn't really have time to question and challenge. I think you're going to find this very interesting, and Professor Carter gives so much historical information that you will never look at the New Testament in the same way again, I would argue, after listening to this episode. Thanks for joining me, Professor Carter. You're coming to me from Oklahoma, is that right?
That's correct, Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Nice, but like Peter at the fire, your accent betrays you. You're from somewhere else, is that right?
Yep, I originate from Aotearoa, New Zealand, way down south, the bottom of the planet. So I grew up there, and then I moved to the US to do study.
And now's your chance to alienate any South African viewers and listeners. Are you an All Blacks supporter in rugby?
I'm supporter might be too strong a word because I'm not sure that support is always merited. And in the face of the mighty Springboks at the moment, who seem to rule the world, one has to be a little hesitant about being an All Black supporter.
Sure.
But I'm very interested in rugby, and I'm also interested in cricket. So I keep an eye on all such things.
Good, good. Now that you've won the audience, we can get down to it. I'm keen to talk to you, Professor Carter, because, well, firstly, as I mentioned to you, I'm going to be using your book, The Roman Empire in the New Testament, in a course that I'm going to get to teach at Stellenbosch University here in South Africa. But also just because you have a wonderful knowledge of the Roman Empire, which I think is so important. When I was cutting my teeth on biblical studies, doing an inductive Bible study program, one of the steps was background information, right? The importance
Mm-hmm.
of knowing where these texts were birthed out of, where they came from. But in your book, you mention the Roman Empire being the foreground, not the background, of any study of the New Testament. Would you mind elaborating on that idea?
Yeah, this is a somewhat contentious claim, but I think a very important one. And I think it's a matter of imaging or naming accurately the historical realities. Um, the language of backgrounds is very common in New Testament studies, and backgrounds or backdrops, it's essentially an image of a stage, as though Jewish things are background to the main action happening on the center of the stage, which of course is the Jesus group.
Sure.
Or Greco-Roman things are the backgrounds and to the stage, and the center of the stage is taken up by the Jesus folks. Um, Now that's stage metaphor, but I think it gets things entirely around the wrong way, and that's why I have not wanted to use it and wanted to use the language of foreground,
Mm.
because the early Jesus folks were a very small group. They were a minority group in the first century, very much a minority group, hardly a blip on the radar to change the metaphor and to anachronize it. So very small, but the dominant cultures are things Jewish and Greek and Roman imperial power. I mean, these are the cultural forces that constituted the world. Um, so, in a sense, you couldn't get out of bed in the morning without stubbing your toe on empire, because
Hmm.
it's simply pervasive. It is the world in the first century. And so, if we're going to talk about the contexts of the early Jesus movement and the ways that they lived and how they read these texts and how these texts originated and all the rest of it, then this is the world that is to the fore. This is the foreground.
Hmm.
Um, I don't think we need to get into an argument about whether Roman stuff's more important than Jewish stuff. I mean, I think we've got a multicultural world. Um,
Sure.
and so forces of various cultures are to the fore. But the Roman Empire is the dominant political, socioeconomic power. It constitutes this world, and it's precisely the world in which the early Jesus folks have to survive and make their way. And of course, they do so as the followers of one who was crucified by this world.
Hmm.
Um, and it's not a world that's just going to be dismissed instantly because we're using an incorrect metaphor.
Here at Bespectacled and Curious, we host interviews with Bible scholars, theologians, and Christian artists. If you want to hear more interesting conversations like this one, please subscribe on your YouTube and follow along wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, that's helpful and thought provoking. And I'm glad you bring up Jesus, because I was going to ask you numerous times in that book, The Roman Empire in the New Testament, you talk about Jesus and kind of make almost an offhand comments about how he dies or why he dies. But ultimately, you say, quote, people get crucified not because they were spiritual, but because they posed a threat to the Roman system, end quote. Yeah, and other times you talk about Jesus challenging the Jewish leaders at the temple and various things, and you say, like, for this attack he dies, for this open and direct challenge he dies. So could you touch a little bit on historically why did Jesus die, and how would you sum up Jesus as being anti-Roman Empire, not just
Yeah,
spiritual as most Christians today would think about him?
right. Yeah, there are a couple of really good questions there. So, how long do we have? Um,
Sorry.
no, good questions. Yeah, so Christians have spiritualized the death of Jesus. And across 2,000 years, we've come up with basically three big spiritualizations of the significance of Jesus' death. It's an atoning sacrifice. Secondly, we've had this tradition of Christus Victor, which
Mhm.
has moved more to emphasize resurrection out of crucifixion. And of course, thirdly, we've had this moral influence theory, usually associated with Abelard, that this is, and based out of Romans chapter 5, this is a demonstration of divine love that calls people or woos people into relationship with God. So those are three different ways of talking about dealing with individual sin and relationship with God. So what the tradition is trying to do is think about ways in which this death is significant or is a death for us pro nobis
Mhm.
that benefits us in some way. Well, that's a fine theological enterprise, and I don't want to dismiss it, except that if we're trying to understand Jesus' death as a death in the first century, none of those explanations is really going to help us very much if we want to think about it in historical circumstances. I mean, God didn't send an email or a text to Jewish leaders or to a Roman governor saying, I've got plans for this guy, so why don't you crucify him? I mean,
Sure.
that's not how it works. So we've got to think about how it happened in terms of the dynamics of power and the
Mhm.
realities of power in the first century. So people didn't get crucified because they were being spiritual or because they were a nice Jewish boy who said his prayers. That didn't get you crucified.
Mhm.
What did get you crucified, and we know this from the gospel account because we have this placard or banner or whatever we want to call it on the cross, identifying Jesus as King of the Jews. Now, the only way that you got to be a king of anything in the Roman Empire was if Rome appointed you to be king as an agent, as a representative of Roman power. And so by that appointment, you were an ally, you were under control of Roman power, you were accountable to Roman power for how you ruled. And of course, the classic example for us in the New Testament is King Herod, who was a Roman puppet king. He was appointed by the Romans. We have a little hiccup in the middle there of his reign when he backs Mark Antony against who will be Emperor Augustus Octavian, which is a little embarrassing because, of course, Antony loses. That's Herod's patron or sponsor. So he has to have a conversation with Octavian Augustus in the middle of all of this, in which he says, oops, I got it wrong. I backed the wrong horse. Sorry about that. But don't think about whose friend I was, but what sort of friend I was. This is his famous argument. Don't think about me as Mark Antony's friend, but what sort of friend I was to Mark Antony. And I will be that same sort of friend to you, Octavian Augustus, if you will let me continue to be king of Judea. And of course, who can turn down such an offer like that? And Augustus says, sure, go ahead, be king. But of course, we all know what will happen if you don't turn out to be loyal. And so Herod becomes extremely loyal and passionate about his commitment to Rome. I mean, he's a classic example of a local guy who's appointed as king by the Romans to represent Roman interests in Judea. Now, we also know from the historian Josephus that through the first century, a bunch of figures emerge at various times who claim to be popular kings. They claim to be popular kings. They get a band of followers. They go off and attack elite interests, royal, imperial interests, and the response is always the same. Rome kills them because this sort of claim to power is regarded as treasonous. It's seditious. It's not sanctioned by Rome. So when you have somebody like Jesus who walks around talking about another empire, the empire of God, and we can talk about that language subsequently, who attracts crowds, these things scare the living daylights out of imperial powers, who's identified by those crowds as a king. Whether he claims it for himself, who knows? But certainly he's identified as by followers as a king who attacks the Roman allies, the Jerusalem-based power group, chief priests, elders, scribes, leading Pharisees, Sadducees, this elite alliance of power. He attacks them for various reasons and attacks the temple. This is a character who just has death sentence written all over him in terms of imperial response. I mean, imperial powers are not going to put up with this sort of nonsense.
Sure.
And so Jesus gets crucified. Of course, in the middle of all of this, he's teaching crowds a different sort of vision of what it means to be a human society. No empire is going to put up with that. So he's put to death as king of the Jews. It's inevitable by the Roman governor Pilate. We can talk about him as well. Now, the second big matter that you mention in your question is this notion of Jesus being anti-empire.
Yes.
And I think that's very true, but I don't think it's the whole story by any stretch of the imagination. And this has been one of the problems that what I would call imperial critical studies, or some people have called empire studies, have both created and have to wrestle with. Because certainly, as some of the early initial work thinking about Gospels especially and the Roman Empire sort of posed this antithesis, this antithetical relationship with only a dynamic of anti-empire attached to it. And that's a pity because, as understanding has emerged and developed, I think we've come to see that negotiations, and that's a much better word, negotiations of empire are multifaceted. And I think we can demonstrate this across the New Testament. At times, Jesus folks have to accommodate. You've got to survive. You've got to get along. I think in the book of Revelation, for example, the writer of Revelation thinks there's too much accommodation, thinks the Jesus folks are too comfy, too much at home in the empire. But there's got to be accommodation to survive. But at the same time, there can be thinking about an alternative way of life, one that seeks the good of others or seeks mercy for others rather than domination. At the same time, you can develop fantasies of revenge, which I think we have in the Gospels. These are what we commonly call eschatological scenarios, where Rome is going to get it. God is going to punish Rome. God is going to set up God's empire. It's going to be the end of Roman power. And I think the early Jesus movement kind of enjoyed these fantasies of revenge and retaliation. We have practices of redefinition. And I think the classic example in the gospel tradition has to do with payment of tax. And we've got that really wacky scene in Matthew chapter 17, where the teachers come, or the officials come and say, we've come to collect the tax money. And we end up finding out from Jesus that the tax coin is in the fish's mouth. Well, what on earth is this all about? Well, tax payment is about submission. You pay your taxes as a symbol of your submission to Roman power. But it gets resignified in that scene. The coin turns up in the fish's mouth. Fish are subject to divine sovereignty. We've had several stories about that in the gospel. So in a sense, God is supplying the coin, and it signifies divine presence and sovereignty in the midst of Roman power and sovereignty. So those with eyes to see pay the tax, which seems to be an act of accommodation, but it's also an act that has an alternative story or alternative significance, a redefinition attached to it, that it points to divine purposes in the midst of Roman purposes. We have practices of repair. That's what healings and feedings and exorcisms are about. These are all expressions of imperial power. 90% of the population were poor to varying degrees. Most of those folks were food insecure. When folks are food insecure, the diseases of contagion and diseases of lack of immunity are rife. That's why there are so many sick people in the Gospels. This is Roman power at work. So healings are acts of repair. And of course, we've got acts of mimicry. We've got acts that replicate Roman power. That's what eschatological scenarios are about. That just as Rome can be violent, so God and Jesus can be very violent in the return of Jesus. We don't like to talk about that as Christians, but it's part of the tradition. Think of the Lord's Prayer. Your empire come, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's a very imperial vision. That's a very imperially imitative petition. Heaven is the realm where God's reign is already established, and so that petition is for God's reign to be extended to planet Earth in a very imperial act. So, those are a bunch of examples of multiple ways in which the tradition negotiates Roman power. So it's not just one thing. It's not just it's not just opposed, but it's also, there are dimensions of accommodation, there are dimensions of repair, there are fantasies of revenge, there's an alternative in the midst of it, there's repair in the midst of it. So it's much more complicated than just a single dynamic.
And then you also get the calls in First Peter, right? To pray for the emperor,
Yes.
to submit to the emperor, to honor the emperor.
Right. Yeah, and that's really interesting. I mean, what does that honoring the emperor mean in First Peter? One of the dominant ways of honoring the emperor was to be involved in offering offerings or small sacrifices or something like that. So what happens when, if you belong to a trade association where all the woodworkers get together once a month, or the food transporters, or the leather workers, or whatever, get together once a month for their sort of what we'd call networking or association meeting. And as part of that meeting, there's always a small offering made to an image of the emperor and or to a god like Jupiter. If you're a Jesus person, what do you do?
Yeah.
Do you go late? You've got a bad habit of lateness. Do you go outside for a cigarette? Or do you stand there and mutter to yourself, Jesus is Lord, Jesus is Lord? Do you cross your fingers behind your back saying, this is just BS, this is nonsense? We don't know. But clearly, some form or even pretense of honouring in 1 Peter is really important. This is part of at least some sort of accommodation. It's part of some sort of survival.
Yeah.
As you say, the command to pray for the emperor is part of the same deal.
That's very helpful, and I've got about 100 follow-up questions, or at least rabbit trails we could go down. I'm trying to decide if I should or not. But I did ask a couple faithful listeners for questions, and maybe one thing you mentioned there is a good segue. One listener, Andrew, he asks, how would a politically aware average resident of the Roman Empire around 50 AD, or perhaps the general time of the Pauline epistles, how would that person understand the Christian claim, Jesus is Lord? And how different would that interpretation be from what modern Christians or people hear when that phrase is said today?
Yeah, that's a really good, thoughtful question. I think it's really important in trying to think about an answer to that, to recognize that these Jesus folks are such a minority group in the social structures of the first century. They're such a small group, and they don't have, as contemporary Christians have, either a significant cultural presence, and however we talk about that, we can talk about that in a number of ways. And likewise don't have, a 2,000-year-long tradition of being socialized into certain actions. For some Christians, and this is a sort of a third dynamic, there is not one beast called Christian. There are lots and lots and lots of different expressions. So that for some Christian folks, the claim of Jesus is Lord might be one to which we give intellectual assent, but essentially in our lives it doesn't make much difference. We very much mirror reflections of our society with mortgages and jobs and all the rest of it. But in some societies, when you're a minority person, this can be a real marker of difference. And I think that's some of what we get in the New Testament writings. What does this difference look like? And it's always got to be balanced with survival and accommodation, but vastly different commitments. So, for example, in 1 Thessalonians, idols are not on the agenda for Jesus as Lord folks. Paul talks about in chapter 1 there of having turned aside from idols. And of course, this is quite different from what we get in 1 Peter. But in 1 Thessalonians, this is a way of life that does not participate in the idolatrous representation of polytheism. Lots and lots of gods who are represented in idols, made present in the forms of idols, and which were very common in society. Again, back to the trade association meeting with the representative of some god's idols. So to not be observant of idols is one marker of what it means to be Jesus as Lord. I mean, that's to differentiate yourself in a very significant way. Various towns and cities, of course, had sponsoring deities. They'd have festivals. So what did you do if you're a Jesus person when there are civic offerings being made? Did you just stay home? And then the next day at work, people want to know, why didn't you join in the festival? What are you going to say? Or do you go and hide in the crowd and mutter to yourself, Jesus is Lord, because I don't believe this anymore? So, I mean, that's just one arena in which it starts to get worked out. 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10, food that's been offered to idols and now made available in the marketplace. Do you eat that or not? It's not clear in 1 Corinthians. Paul's got an opinion, but certainly he doesn't have the only opinion. And so I think we could go down a whole host of those sorts of things. And I think it's important to recognize that, especially in the Pauline letters, they're still working this stuff out.
Sure, yeah.
Not quite making it up as they go along, but trying to think through the implications of what it means for Jesus to be Lord.
Because often you hear like Jesus is Lord, so Caesar is not. So is that kind of direct opposite? I know we just spoke about the varying responses to Caesar and the empire, but would that be more of a in-your-face, explicitly anti-Caesar statement, or is Jesus Lord among other lords to the ear?
Well, I think it's a kind of a both and, because, as much as it's oppositional, and I think it is, you've also got survival and accommodation.
Yeah.
So, there's no point, in a sense, walking around saying Caesar is not Lord, because people just think you're delusional and crazy. And that's not really a strength or a virtue. So, there is the recognition that Caesar has ruling power, and that power affects your life. But whether you give that power an absolute quality or whether you give Jesus the absolute quality, I think becomes the difference. So I want to think in terms of, rather than the stark yes, no, I want to think in terms of some shades of grey, because it's that claim, Jesus is Lord and Caesar is Lord, is going to impact life in different ways. I mean, Caesar is Lord, so yes, you pay your taxes. But in the gospel stories, there's dissent from the absolute significance of submission, of paying your taxes, because there's a greater loyalty of Jesus as Lord. Sure. So, you've got both at the same time. One might be more obvious socially, societally. The other might be, in a sense, more hidden, but the more hidden might be more important.
I wonder if maybe you could touch more on the Roman religious system in the first century. Of course, it's so different from in the, whatever greater Western world, whatever you want to call it. Religion is a private thing. Usually it's a personal thing. It's very different from politics, or at least often is interwoven, but at least not necessarily connected. So how might Paul's comment, even that you mentioned in Thessalonians, that these new believers turn to the living God from idols, how would that be an anti-establishment or politically dangerous action?
Trying to get our heads around this difference is really important, because in the ancient world, religion is political in a number of ways, and religion is communal. Religion is public. That's not to say that folks didn't have personal commitments and personal benefits from religious observance, which has been one way that, especially some Christian scholars in the past have talked about it. People were just going through the motions, the gods were ridiculous, nobody believed in them, and all the rest of it. I don't think that's true for half a second. It might have been true for a few people, but I don't think it was true generally, and I think we have a ton of evidence for folks taking the gods very seriously in their ways of life. So Roman religion is polytheistic. It's multiple. You don't just have one God, which of course is a fundamental difference with Jewish Christian tradition. You have numerous gods, because gods are often associated with particular either places or aspects of life. So Ceres, the goddess from whom we get our name cereal, but the goddess Ceres, a god of harvest and fertility and wheat, really important for food supply. So as you planted your crops, whether you were a peasant farmer with half an acre or whether you were a landowner with much greater estates, the goddess Ceres was important. So, there are lots more examples like that.
Sure.
So fundamental to all of this is that you have to keep these gods happy so that they will bless who you are and how you live. And so you keep them happy in a number of ways, with sacrifices, with offerings, with charms, with ways that ward off evil spirits and evil forces. You seek their favor. You don't wish to alienate them or anger them, because misfortune would be an expression of punishment. This is the sort of world that folks lived in. So honoring the gods, both within your household, within your town, within your city, within the empire, becomes really important to ensure that you have these sorts of blessings rather than punishment. We have all these charms, we have all these amulets, which people wear, which people take very seriously. I mean, we've got manuscripts of these things, of what you're supposed to burn, or what you're supposed to wear, or what you're supposed to eat, or what you're supposed to drink, as ways of providing protection, but also of warding off evil spirits, but maintaining good fortune. People have mosaics on their floors in houses that ward off curses and punishments. That's how seriously people take it. I mean, I don't know if you've been in a house recently where you've seen that sort of mosaic inside the front door. I certainly haven't, but it was common in the ancient world. Now, beyond all of that, we have the same sort of alignment going on at an imperial level. We have this national epic, this great long poem by the poet Virgil, this poem called the Aeneid, 12 books of Latin translation. There's an adventure. And in book 1 of the Aeneid, Virgil sets up the scene with the god Jupiter, who declares that he has given to the Romans empire without end, and has given to the Romans a mission to go and subdue the world, to bring low the proud, but to sort of rehabilitate those who don't resist, who happily cooperate. This is in Virgil's poem, and there's a lot of debate about how propagandist this is, and how much Virgil dissented from it, and how much he endorsed it, and all the rest of it. But it's there. This is the understanding that Rome is divinely sanctioned, and we have lots and lots and lots of examples and all sorts of writers where the same notion of the god's favor is so important for the empire. And it sets up this sort of dynamic, sort of a national identity of piety. So you honor the gods. You then go to war and you get divine favor. You have victory over the people because the goddess Victoria has blessed you. Or if we want to go to Greek, the goddess Nike, long before she was a sports apparel company, goddess of victory, blessed you. And that led to peace. Which actually meant the submission of your enemies, and no longer were they causing you trouble. So, I mean, that's a fundamental dynamic of piety, of war, of victory, and peace. Some people have called this sort of an imperial theology, and I don't think that's an inappropriate name for this sort of ideology. And ensuring this divine favor was something that emperors worried about for centuries. Because if things started to go wrong, if some of the legions got beaten up by the Parthians or the Germans, or if there were droughts, if there were major plagues, then folks got very worried that the gods were alienated from Rome in some way, that they were angry with Rome. And so for centuries, emperors tried to devise various schemes to unify folks around offering favor to the gods. So, all of this is really, really, really important. And so the pressure is on in households, in local towns, villages, cities, to be seen to be securing the favor of the gods. So to give up idols is to make a fairly bold statement that this is not where your interests are anymore. And subsequently, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christians try to make the argument that, they don't do idols, but that doesn't mean to say that they're totally subversive and horrible people either. Which is a distinction that a number of ruling authorities find very hard to understand, understandably.
Sure. That's a really great overview. And also in the book, you mention the food system, which I think is very thought-provoking, and it's very different from the way we probably engage with food, right? This is a society that is very dependent upon land and agriculture. I'm doing my dissertation right now on animals, Jesus and animals. So I've learned a lot about, the use of animals in the Roman Empire, which is fascinating.
Yes.
But could you just give us a little rundown on the food system and even how that's connected to Paul's collection for the Jewish Jesus followers
Sure.
and how that might be anti-imperial?
So the food system is very much a political system also. And this is one of the things that, we've got to get our heads around, that imperial power just doesn't mean legions. Legions going off to war. Imperial power pervades every aspect of life. The empire was very hierarchical, very hierarchical. So we've got a very small ruling elite group, 2 or 3%. We've got a middling group, maybe 10%. And then my math's not very good, but I think that leaves about 85% of the population who know degrees of poverty. We've just had a book published very recently at the end of 2025 called Surviving Rome, How the 90% Lived. And the author, Kim Bowes, talks about the 90% as the degrees of poverty that most inhabitants of the empire lived in. So that meant a constant struggle for adequate food. And this has been recognized by a number of folks. A scholar by the name of Peter Garnsey has made the statement that for most of the population, life was a daily struggle for survival, which is very hard for us to imagine in our overstuffed societies, except for some folks in our societies, of course. But if you think of 80 to 90% of the population as food insecure, this is stunning.
Crazy. Yeah.
It is. And we know, we've got evidence of this in terms of lifespans. The average lifespan, according to some folks who do the demography thing, in the 20s, 25 as an average lifespan. Some would go even lower, 22 as an average lifespan. Incredible. So lots of sickness, lots of disease because folks don't have immunity, we have poor nutrition. Of course, we don't have an understanding of good nutrition. We don't have an understanding of even basic hygiene, sorts of things that we know. Of course, we don't have concerns about, adequate diets. But elite folks ate pretty well because they had resources, partly from land production, but also just from trade, to access abundant food and good food. So we have a cookbook actually in the name of a guy called Apicius, who was sort of the male Martha steward of the day, with all sorts of exotic recipes in it. And you can replicate these yourself these days if you want to. But to think that the average Roman jogged home to a beautifully prepared multi-course dinner of these sort of exotic foods is just living in the land of fantasy. It simply didn't happen like that.
Mm.
So we've got much of the population as a rural population, land-based, small land holdings, very much dependent on weather, on soil quality. You can have good years, you can have bad years, very much dependent on quality of seed that you sow. So all of these things affecting the food supply as well. Sometimes you're doing very well. Tax, of course, is sometimes paid in coin, but tax can also be paid in kind. So you literally load up a wagon and off they take your food supply for the year. You can't go to the supermarket and buy some frozen goods. So, many folks, I think, probably enjoyed a part of the year good eating from crops, but then cycled into poor eating, but below subsistence level for other parts of the year. Again, this is Roman power at work. And the other problem, of course, with land is if your territory happens to get caught up in a war, then to victors go the spoils. And that's not just a cliche, that means they take your land. We know that folks on land take out loans, they can't repay the loans, their land gets seized, they end up as tenant farmers now paying rent on their own land, or they get dispossessed completely and off they go to the nearest town or city to be a day labourer, to be a beggar. There's no future in that. There's no safety net. You're going to fall out the bottom pretty quickly, unfortunately. So this is a pretty cruel world. Nobody's living a Roman dream of pulling themselves up by the sandal straps and getting up into the higher levels. Folks are desperately holding on by the fingernails so that they don't sink further into this sort of world of poverty.
Yeah, so in light of all that context, how would that relate to Paul's kind of collection that overshadows so many of his letters?
What I think happens there, and several people have argued this, is that the collection is formulated as kind of, how to say it, an anti-tax system. So put into conversation with a tax system which removes goods, removes wealth, removes production from provinces and takes it to the center, to Rome, or to centers of power in cities around the empire, where elites, of course, have the access to it. So instead of that sort of central movement to power, the collection moves from one small group to another small group. So from the churches in Achaia, etc., to Jerusalem. And it's an action not of depleting folks of resources, but of supplying folks in need with resources that they actually need. So it's not about feeding elites, it's about supplying folks who need supplies in this particular way. So folks have seen it as kind of an anti-tax, as a way in terms of how tax is levied for the benefit of elites, to now being an expression of care and concern for other folks who are suffering. And of course, it's overladen with issues of ethnicity, of predominantly Gentile congregations supplying folks who are predominantly Jewish folks in Jerusalem in a time of need. Will they accept the offering? Will they accept these resources? Will they thereby recognize that together this is a whole different understanding of society and of human unity? So I think that's tied up in the mix as well.
Makes me think of, I recently spoke to a theologian, Latin American scholar named Ruth Padilla de Borst, and she was talking about how like intentional Christian communities and churches can be like pockets of resistance, I think is the phrase she used.
Yeah.
Something similar, like an anti-tax movement. I did want to ask you, and I like asking scholars just to respond to some criticism that maybe they've received or their ideas have received. You speaking to me now are very nuanced, and yeah, I really enjoy a lot of what you've been saying. Like you said, there's this group which you may or may not be part of, empire studies within biblical studies. I'm thinking of yourself, Neil Elliott, Richard Horsley, John Dominic Rasson, even N.T. Wright to a degree, have been critiqued. Perhaps most charitably, John Barclay wrote the essay "Why the Roman Empire Was Insignificant to Paul." Talks about how, perhaps some scholars turn the Roman emperor into the opposing chess team's king when really he's just a pawn in this larger cosmic force of Paul's vision. Or more critically, and perhaps less charitably, some have said, this wing developed in George Bush years, and it's kind of progressive left wing neo Marxist politics. That's a quote from somewhere. I'm trying to remember where I pulled that from. That's just used to criticize American politics. So, how would you respond to these criticisms that you're trying to see too much in the New Testament? It's not really that focused on Rome.
Yeah, it's really been interesting to hear and read some of this stuff. Of course, this whole way of reading the New Testament and thinking about the early Jesus movement is so different, as we've noted, from 21st or 20th century religion, personal, individual, interior, comfortable, etc., etc., and a very different way of thinking in scholarly terms about the early Jesus movement. So it's going to have those who want to push back because it upsets some very thought out and argued and identified ways of reading the early Jesus movement. I'm kind of entertained sometimes by the level of passion that it provokes. I remember one session with one scholar, we were talking about John's Gospel. I thought he was literally going to have a heart attack. He was so upset. He was so angry that anyone could even think about John's Gospel in any other ways other than personal spiritual faith. And I don't think we did a very good job of calming him down, but it was really quite silly. I mean, another scholar has called it a fad. But I'm sorry, but the Roman Empire is not so easily dismissed. I hear this question regularly at conferences if I present a paper on this aspect. Some scholar will stand up and say, and sort of squeeze out a question, show me one verse in the New Testament that's got anything to do with Rome. And so I simply say, well, the main character gets crucified on a Roman cross. So does that help? and that's sort of the end of the conversation. This you make too much of empire thing. So a little bit of empire apparently is okay. So if we mention a soldier or a governor or the emperor, that's all right, but don't push it any further. Which is really underthought and under-theorized, because it's a bit like saying capitalism exists only when I use my credit card or only when I check my investments. The rest of the time, capitalism doesn't exist. Well, we know that's just utter nonsense. Of course it exists the rest of the time. And I think, we have an analogy with empire, that we have soldiers, we have governors. Well, they're just a tip of a great big imperial iceberg, so to speak, of a great big system. And I think I've tried to show in a number of articles, and I've just completed an 1,800-page commentary on Matthew's Gospel, that every part of these writings is caught up in imperial presence in various ways. And a little bit of empire, it's like a little bit pregnant. It just doesn't work. And I can go through pericope by pericope, if we had all afternoon, in Matthew's Gospel, pointing out genealogies, conceptions of great men. Herod is getting all bent out of shape in Matthew chapter 2 because he's a puppet king of Rome. And, it doesn't say in the text, dear reader, don't forget the following 5 things about Herod. You're just supposed to know this stuff. And we have all the conflicts and all the rest of it. The misreadings of Pilate have particularly bothered me, because a lot of the critique has come from folks who haven't done their work in empire. I mean, it's not as though we woke up one morning and decided we're going to write some nonsense about empire. I mean, there's a whole bunch of study here called classical studies, where folks wrestle with these questions. And you need to be familiar with this work to be part of the conversation. This reading of the Pilate scene, where he's poor, weak, wimpy Pilate, who has his arm twisted up his back by the big, bad, nasty Jewish leaders. And he's forced to crucify the nice Jesus, whom he really thinks is quite a nice guy. I mean, this is nonsense. One scholar talks about how Pilate is, in Matthew, politically neutral. I mean, when you are the face of Roman power in a province and you have the power to execute people, the last thing you are on the planet is politically neutral. You've got, how did people get to be a governor? Well, there was a training process. There was a training process in military and in civil power. You had to work your way through that. You had to show that you had the whatevers to be able to be competent or self-serving, at least, in this role. And Pilate's not a wimp. And I think in the gospel stories, he does a really good day's governing. He makes his allies beg for him to execute Jesus, by playing hard to get. Why? What wrong has he done? He makes them beg, just because they want him to execute Jesus. He's not going to, because they flick their fingers. He's the governor. And so in the power struggle with his allies, he plays hard to get. They beg, which is really nice. And he polls the crowd. Who do you want me to execute? What's he done? And the more they shout for Jesus, the more he understands, well, if I'm going to execute someone who's king of the Jews, I need to know how much support he has. Is there going to be fallout? So I think in the end, he does a pretty astute day's work. I know that's not a popular thing to say about Pilate, but I think if we understand something about governors, then there we are. Some folks have said there's too much emphasis on the Roman Empire and there's not enough emphasis on things Jewish. I think that's a false dichotomy. Jewish folks post 70, when the Gospels are written, are also negotiating Roman power. I think in Matthew's Gospel, the Jesus folks are still part of a synagogue. And I think that part of the nasty stuff in the Gospel, and the Gospel is very nasty about some Jewish folks in synagogues, I think is a reflection of this dynamic that has been well identified as horizontal violence. That when imperial power or governing power is asserted from above, then groups fight each other in horizontal violence, both verbal and physical, because they can't fight back. Its power is too overwhelming. So I don't see that you have to choose one or the other. Jewish folks are also negotiating Roman power in the Gospel. Some folks have complained, and I was a bit surprised by this argument because it makes no sense, that there's too much emphasis on the Roman Empire. Now, I know that in chapter 4, verse 8, the devil offers Jesus all the empires of the world, Basileus, it's an accusative plural. And so some folks have trotted this out and said, well, why are you so obsessed with Rome? What about Parthia? And my response is, well, what about Parthia? I mean, of course, Parthia is one of Rome's enemies, but the gospel is particularly concerned with Rome. If you want to read the gospel in relation to Parthia, good luck to you. Go for it. How to you? If you want to read it in relation to some Chinese empire, go for it. Good luck. I think that'll be an interesting reading. But none of that successfully says don't pay attention to Roman power when we've got references to Roman power in the gospel. I mean, that's not going to help us one bit. It's kind of a silly argument. The other opposition, I think, comes from those who are upset that this reading that takes societal contexts material contexts, physicality, political structures seriously, diminishes attention to souls.
Sure, sure.
And so this approach reformulates soteriology. It foregrounds visions of society, societal practices, the use of power, who benefits, who gets disadvantaged, who gets left out.
Yeah.
It foregrounds a vision of human interactions. And some think, well, there's not enough attention on souls and forgiveness of my sins. Well, yeah, I do think it moves the emphasis, and I do think that's not a bad thing. I think the Gospels are very concerned with how people live.
Sure, yeah.
That's and that's part of their visioning of a different way of living. I
Yeah.
can even find a verse. You know how it is with the great men, how they lord it over others. It shall not be so among you.
Yes, yes.
It's an understanding of a different way of organizing society. So those are some of the main critiques that I've seen. But I have to say that I'm disappointed that often they're very shallow, uh, because people haven't done their work, haven't done their
Yeah.
work on empire, haven't done their work on what imperial structures look like.
I do like how you ended that. I mean, that's a very helpful response, but I like how you ended that by saying a lot of these are false dichotomies, right? Even in my earlier question about why Jesus died, I think, as a reader of the New Testament and someone interested in history, especially, like, I do need to investigate the historical reasons, but this doesn't necessarily take away my understanding theologically of Jesus' death at the same time, or even how someone like Paul and the other authors interpreted that historical
Mhm.
reality theologically, right?
Right.
So I'm grateful for your work and for others like you in that you give us these tools that we can investigate the Roman situation, but it doesn't take away from more theological readings, right? I think an integrated approach is always helpful, at least for me. So I'm appreciative of your work.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because I think that it's important that we don't confuse 2,000 years of theological reflection
Yes.
with some actual historical realities.
Hmm.
Um, the 2,000 years might be interpretations of those realities, but the gospel according to Matthew is not the gospel according to Abelard. So I think that around Jesus' death, one of the things that the gospel does is expose. I think it's a revelatory death. It exposes the lengths that an imperial system, a power system, will go to protect its own interests. The lengths that it'll go to remove somebody who is understood to be a challenge to it.
Mm-hmm.
But the gospel also makes a theological claim at that point
Mm-hmm.
that the extent to which the powers will go is actually very limited in the face of God's life-giving power. In
Mm-hmm.
other words, they can't keep him dead.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And of course, resurrection's not the end either. So we've got all this anticipation of the return of Jesus, which I understand that respectable Christians don't like to talk about, but it's part of the gospel story. And whatever, 2,000 years and counting, I'm not unaware of the problem. There
Sure,
is a
sure.
problem there. But the statement of the divine purposes that will triumph. So there's a whole sort of a revelatory interpretation of the historical material going on even in the Gospels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I'm tempted to get into theological areas and flesh out some of the statements you've made, but for the sake of time, rather not. I would like to talk about maybe some contemporary things. Reading your book alongside, I try to listen to my nightly news podcast as I do the dishes,
Mhm.
and you can't help but notice patterns in the Roman world and patterns in our own world. I'm thinking, Bernie Sanders would have had a field day protesting the oligarchy of the Roman Empire, at least before he would have been killed for that. Or I'm thinking of your description of the Roman emperor as someone who, lorded all the power and kind of gave favors to other people, expecting them, endorsing other candidates, shall we say, for different positions,
Mm-hmm.
expecting them to give favors back to him. We see this kind of thing in the news all the time. So, to what degree are things similar in our own time, and what do you think are just some very basic things that communities that claim to follow Jesus should be at least thinking about, if not acting upon? Could you sketch any of that out? I know it's a very broad
I
question.
think that I think your point about some similarities. Of course, there are enormous differences in terms of
Sure, sure.
at least what a pseudo-democratic society looks like. Bernie hasn't been killed yet, so there is that possibility. But people do pay a price for opposition. We know that. But I think that communities who take this stuff seriously. I think there's a sort of a double process. There's a decolonization of minds, sorting out our thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there's a decolonization of bodies, of how we live and what we do. And I think that both of those are really important. And I think the gospel attends to both of those. The Herod story. So Herod gets all bitter and twisted about the announcement from the Magi that there's a newborn king of the Jews. I mean, it's a fairly silly thing for wise men to be saying in the capital of Jerusalem and in the presence of the king. There's a newborn king, and we don't mean you, Herod. I mean, that's not smart. But anyway, Herod gets all upset about it. And so the narrative then sets about revealing his responses. So he wants to turn the Magi into spies. Go find out where this guy's born. Come back and tell me. Come back. And this is after he's already investigated with his allies where such a figure ought to be born. And they, of course, trot out the verse from Micah. So we've got allies, and then we've got spies. These things rhyme, which is kind of nice. Allies and spies. And he then tells them lies, that I too might come and worship him. Allies, spies, lies. And then, when all of that fails, he resorts to infanticides. Now, apart from my very nice rhyming, what that chapter does is alert readers to classic strategies of powerful figures. Mm-hmm. They use their alliances. They tell lies. They set up spies, which you can interpret in a number of ways. And then they can resort to violence, verbal or physical. Mm-hmm. That's part of what I mean is get our heads educated, get ourselves understanding what these tactics are and understand that they are tactics in the pursuit of power. But at the same time, sitting around understanding is nice, but what actions are possible in a particular situation? And I think that's very much situationally and contextually determined. But I think there's a marvelous book by this guy James Scott called Domination and the Arts of Resistance. And it's an old book now, 1990. I mean, that's really old. But he investigated this middle space. He asked the question, so how do folks negotiate assertions of power? One is to do nothing. Another is to do violence. But what about the ground in the middle? What happens in the middle? Are there other ways of negotiating these assertions of power that are neither passive acceptance nor violent resistance? And he provides example after example after example from across human history of groups that have negotiated power in all sorts of ways. He sets the book up, if I might quote a proverb that I hope won't offend anybody. but it's a proverb, I think, that he attributes to Ethiopians. The governor passes by. You can substitute the governor for the emperor passes by, the king passes by, the general passes by, the landlord passes by. The peasants bow and fart. Now, it's not going to change the world, but it's an anonymous dissenting act. It's an anonymous, disrespectful act. It's a dignifying act. It's an act that says, we don't buy your lies. We don't buy what you're doing as a reasonable or natural or acceptable order for human beings. So he's not suggesting that we get all flatulent about things, but he's suggesting that we use our imaginations and think about what are appropriate acts of dissent, what are appropriate acts of reassertion of dignity in the midst of it. And I think we have a nice example of this in Matthew's Gospel in the Sermon on the Mount, that when the soldier asks you to carry the pack, not asks you, demands that you carry the pack of 1 mile, you discombobulate the whole thing and say, yeah, I'll do a couple of miles for you.
Yeah.
Again, it's not going to change the empire because you can't change the empire, but it's a form of engagement that is off-putting, that reconfigures the power arrangement even momentarily. Or someone takes you to court and sues you for your outer garment. Well, give them your undergarment as well, which literally exposes, the sort of power grab that you're engaged in here. Again, I don't want to make a lot of that sounds light and trivial, but we've got to think of those sorts of appropriate acts and actions. The healings, the care of the sick, the supplying of food, the casting out of demons, the lending without expecting repayment. Are all these sort of acts that we have from the Gospels. And these are not instructions given to wealthy people, do a little bit of lending out of your excess. Yeah. These aren't wealthy people, these are poor people. But that solidarity, that communal support for one another, you can't do this unless you do it in community. It's too hard. That's what I think communities need to be about.
You mentioned you finished recently your big commentary on Matthew. Congratulations. It's a big accomplishment. Is there anything, any conviction or even interpretation that you might have changed your mind about over the course of engaging so deeply with Matthew's gospel?
I don't think and some folks will be disappointed to hear this, I don't think I have repented of my basic thesis. Or my basic reading. But what I continue to do is to explore the implications of it, to press the implications of it. Scenes that we sort of can take for granted, to think about what are the imperial structures around the scene. Like Jesus calls 4 fishermen. It's a 4-verse scene. Very quick. Follow me. They say, sure. Off they go. Well, that's nice. But what are the socioeconomic structures around that scene? How do you get to be a fisherman? What sort of contracts do you have? What sort of commitments do you have? And when their father watches his kids and his workforce walk off down the beach, what does he say? Well, there's some things you can't print in the Bible, I reckon. Or, Bartimaeus, blind beggar, sitting by the roadside. What are the imperial socioeconomic structures around that figure? So, I wanted to press the analysis, which won't please some people, but I want to continue to dig away at the imperial structures and how folks are negotiating them, and sometimes in opposition, but not necessarily in opposition. Sometimes just a survival, which is what a beggar is trying to do.
Sure.
And of course, not all beggars were the same thing in the ancient world. We have a whole bunch of different expressions of what it means to be a beggar. So that's what I've continued to do. But I think rather than anything, I've given up the fundamental conviction of what does it mean to be a human being, and how do we be human beings together in a society? How do we seek the good of one another? I don't think that makes me some sort of lunatic lefty. I think that's rooted in basic human decency and respect.
Not to mention the teaching of Jesus, love your neighbor as you
Yeah.
love yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it might have something to do with the love command. It might have something to do with living with the recognition that we're all of us, somehow in the image of God. So it might have something to do with that rather than being some sort of lunatic lefty.
Very good, very good. Just in closing, are you working on anything else now? You've written quite a few books. I should mention Matthew at the Margins.
Yes.
Yes, I used that quite a bit in my master's thesis, which I found really helpful. But what are you working on now?
So the recent Matthew commentary, the 2-volume thing, is sort of Matthew on the Margins on steroids.
Okay,
I've learned a few things since I wrote Matthew on the Margins, so
okay, good.
it's sort of arguing the same thing, but in more detail. I've also done this book recently with Ariel Feldman, looking at interactions between Jesus movement and Judaism. And we called it with the subtitle "Troubling Misunderstandings." Ariel Feldman's a scholar of early Judaism, and so we got together around sort of things that Christians claim about early Judaism.
Okay,
All Jews are waiting for the Messiah. No, they're not. I know that that's conventional wisdom, but there's no textual support for it. Some Jews were. So we look at some of those sorts of misunderstandings and we try and trouble them. So that's appeared recently. My current project is one that I just kind of hinted at. I want to look at some of these characters that we have, particularly in the Gospels, but I'll venture elsewhere as well. Folks who are, amongst the non-elite,
yeah.
trades workers, crafts workers. Simon the tanner. What did it mean to be a tanner? How did you participate in the socioeconomic structures of the empire as a tanner? Shepherds. What does it mean to be a shepherd? What sort of structures did you participate in and what were you accountable for? Beggars. Lydia, trading in purple cloth. Dorcas, making clothes for people. I'm not doing a sort of historical Simon search. I'm not questing for the historical Simon because we're never going to find him. But we do know some things about tanners. We do know stuff about what they did and how they did it. There's a significant amount of work that we can at least sketch out some possible socioeconomic structures and participations. We know some things about shepherds. We get a bunch of contracts around shepherds from papyri from Egypt. What sort of structures did shepherds enter into? So those sorts of things I want to poke around in and kind of earth the analysis, I guess, in some ways. The other 90%, how were they living? What were they doing? What can we understand about them? Again, not questing for historical, but trying to sketch out some of those structures. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Carter, for your time. It's been a pleasure. I wasn't expecting to talk this long. I'm sure you can go for another hour, but maybe another time.
Sure, we could. But thanks, Jonathan. I really appreciate it and appreciate the engagement. And thanks for the good questions.
If this conversation was worth your time, you can follow the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts for more, subscribe on YouTube, and leave a comment below. Tell me who you think I should interview next, what stood out to you from this episode, or what you think we got completely wrong. I can take it. And if one person came to mind while you were listening, maybe a friend, a colleague, maybe someone who would push back on everything that was said, send it to them. That's one of the best ways to help this show. Thanks for listening. I'm Jonathan Tizik. This is Bespectacled and Curious. See you next time. Stay curious, everybody.